Welcome back to Money Life. I'm Chuck Bentley. My guest today is Chad Hovind, Senior Pastor of Horizon Community Church in Cincinnati, Ohio. And Chad, when we left off, we were talking about how important it is to understand that capitalism doesn't mean that you now are greedy and only interested in your personal needs, but that you can also be generous with what you have. And Jesus' teaching indicate that free enterprise is actually a good thing as long as it's balanced with sharing. Chad, this is a core foundation in God's economy, isn't it?
Without a doubt. I define Godonomics as experiencing liberty, prosperity, and generosity. And generosity is a key part of that, which is that I want to give to other people. You know, Josephus was a historian during the time, Jewish historian during the time of the Romans, and he said the Romans didn't give anything to anyone. The Christians, on the other hand, came along, and they were far generous, so generous, in fact, that they took care of their own poor and the poor in the Roman Empire. And they did it not by hiring the Roman government to steal from one person to give to another, but they personally produced. And you see lots of folks, even Barnabas, the son of encouragement, you know, he would sell land, he would give to other people. There was radical, radical generosity. And that's true even today. In fact, in his book, Who Really Cares, the author investigates who is it that really is the most generous. And he says, by far, the factors that contribute to generosity, those who give the most, it's church attendance, it's those who have a commitment to Christ, and those who do not think it's the role of government to give, in other words, stealing somebody else's stuff, but rather to give personally. And that's honestly where you get the most benefit and joy. When you teach your kids to give their own money, that's the hard part. When you give them a quarter and they put their own, your tithe in, a little quarter into the offering plate, it doesn't change their heart. I remember last year for Christmas, we had the kids really wrestle with giving one of their favorite toys to some family in our church that were in need. And I tell you, they were in tears, wrestling with their own greed. They wanted to give away some crummy toy or, Mom and Dad, you buy something. But it is so important that we learn to be generous with our own stuff because that's what changes our heart.
Sure. And even in the parable of the Good Samaritan used his personal resources on 3 occasions to administer health care to the person who was wounded. He paid out of his own pocket. He didn't go and get other people's tax money to take care of this person laying on the side of the road. So obviously we have personal responsibility to care for others out of our own resources.
Yeah.
Chad, in your study, you've come to recognize that believers are very misinformed about the differences between capitalism and socialism, and they're getting very confused right now. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's probably the fault of people like myself. I mean, I'm a pastor, and we probably preach on things like worry and family and why you should give to the church and stresses and things like that. But I'm not sure that we've taught God's principles on things like inflation, property rights, deficit spending, the role of government, the importance of freedom and liberty. I'm just not sure that we've done our job in instructing folks. And probably because we've been so worried, and I'm the same. I don't want anybody to think that Jesus is a Democrat or Jesus is a Republican. But there are biblical principles that transcend that. And I guess what's gotten me motivated is realizing when you look at our country today, we're $12 trillion in debt, more than that now, according to usdebtclock.org, and we're $120 trillion in debt when you look at unfunded liabilities. All through the Scripture, God gives some very clear warnings. In Deuteronomy, he says, do not borrow from other nations, or else they will become the head and you will be the tail. That phrase, the tail wagging the dog, comes from that Scripture. And it's God commanding a nation not to borrow. And yet we're borrowing. And what that does, it steals from our children and grandchildren.
Well, not only that, it enslaves us to another master because Scripture says that the borrower is servant to the lender. And that is not a political statement, that you're going to be a servant to the lender, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat.
I always say you don't break God's commandments, you discover them. You're going to discover that you're going to be servant to your lender, whether you believe it or not. It's going to be true. And then, so some people say, well, then we'll just print more money, the Federal Reserve. Over the last 100 years, we've devalued the dollar somewhere between 90 to 95%. Well, who does that hurt? It hurts the poor, those who have the least amount of money. And all through the Scripture, God says, I hate unjust weights. I want honest weights, honest weights, honest weights. But you don't hear a lot of messages about that. And even this bailout recently, well, that was bailed out by the International Monetary Fund, of which we as Americans are, somewhere between 15 to 20%. So we just bailed out the Greeks for their overspending. Why should our children and grandchildren pay for taxes and inflation and higher prices for somebody else and their poor management.
Yeah, not only poor management, Chad, but there's just a tremendous amount of corruption in their system. And they're not only terrible money managers, but they're not even honest in the way that they deal with their challenges in their economy. They've been lying about it even as to how big the problem is.
And that's why I think greed is so, there's high-class greed, there's middle-class greed, there's low-class greed. Greed comes in many, many forms. I mean, Jesus says, beware the many faces of greed. And, there's entitlement. When you think you deserve something that you didn't work for or you can't afford yet, but somebody else ought to give it to you, that's greed.
Now, Chad, we have just a moment, but you've put together a video series called Godonomics. Give us a definition of Godonomics. What do you mean by that term?
Well, Godonomics is God's wisdom on money. Something used to be called common sense. It's about being generous to the poor. It's about not stealing, and by implication, not electing other people to steal for you, paying your taxes, rewarding hard work, property rights. And by implication, it's why capitalism, free market capitalism, is most aligned to God's principles.
So, Chad, how has this study been helping people in your own congregation? What impact has it had?
Well, several things. It has taught people not only at a macro level what God's principles are, but how do I play that out? And how do I look at my own spending? How do I look at my own not spending tomorrow's money today? How do I make sure I understand that when I go to vote, that I want to vote for people who aren't going to enslave my children and grandchildren? Beyond that, we're seeing folks who are beginning to see the value of hard work, teaching that to your kids. I got lots of folks who hire people